Converting static HTML files to Razor files is just the first step in creating a dynamic web application. It's the ability to write C# code right within views that makes Razor so useful. And in this video, I'll show you the basics of the Razor syntax. At a glance, there's not really much to the Razor syntax. For most scenarios, all you need to do is type the @ character anywhere in the page, immediately followed by the C# code that you want to execute and render. For example, let's say that I want to add a copyright to my page and make sure that it always emits the current year so that I don't have to remember to update it all the time. I can just do this. Notice how I get full IntelliSense when I begin writing code after the @ sign. Now when I run this page and scroll to the bottom, I can see that Razor has evaluated that expression and rendered the resulting value as text right into the page. Now, that's a pretty simple example, but the real power of Razor lies in HTML helpers. HTML helpers are methods provided by the ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core MVC, and many other libraries, and they're able to emit entire sections of dynamic HTML with a single method call. For instance, the HTML helper that you'll probably use the most in your ASP.NET Core MVC applications is the HTML.ActionLink helper, which generates anchor tags based on a controller and an action name. For example, let's scroll to line 45 in our index view to find the link to the blog section of our site. By looking at it, I can tell that this path will end up mapping to the index action on the blog controller, but if I change that route, I'll want this link to stay in sync with that new route, ideally without me having to search for it and replace it manually in all of our views. Instead, I can replace this whole anchor tag with a call to HTML.ActionLink like this. This version of the ActionLink helper takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is the text to show in the link, or what I want the user to read on the page. The second parameter is the name of the action that I want to link to, and the third parameter is the name of the controller that the action lives in. Notice how I only use the beginning of the name of the controller type and drop the word controller from it. Now, when I run this application, the link still looks and behaves as it did before. It still brings me to the blog section. Only now, I just have to be concerned with controller actions as opposed to URLs. Actually, it behaves almost as it did before. If I inspect the element, I see that it's missing the title attribute like it used to have. Well, that's easy enough to fix. The ActionLink helper has another overload that accepts 2 more parameters, a route data object and an HTML attributes object. I'll show the route data object in action later in the course, so for now, we can just leave it null. Then, for the last parameter, I'll create an anonymous type to define the HTML attributes object, and then each of its properties will render as attributes on the anchor tag. In other words, if I want to define a value for the title attribute, I simply create a property named title and assign it the value that I want rendered inside of the title attribute. Now I can save this, refresh the page, and hover over the link to show this text. This version of the ActionLink helper works great, but personally, I like a little more direct control over my HTML. So the alternative that I like to use is the URL.ActionHelper method. Like the HTML ActionLink helper method, this helper method takes the names of the action and controller. However, unlike the HTML helper method, the URL.action method renders only the value of the URL itself and no additional HTML. That means that I can replace this whole line like this. This approach ends up rendering the exact same HTML as the HTML ActionLink helper I just showed. However, it really just comes down to how much code you want generated for you. The HTML ActionLink helper and the URL action helper methods are just 2 of the many helper methods available in the framework. Be on the lookout for them, as I'll end up showing several more of them throughout this course. And even though they're a good enough example of the Razor syntax in action, Keep in mind that you can use that @ syntax to render the result of any C# code that you like.